Can everyone hear me? Great. So thank you for being here. We call this the graveyard shift between either just before lunch or just after lunch. So thank you for remaining with us for that period. We're here to discuss an interesting book, and I won't lie to you, my every instinct was to chat GPT the content before reading it.
Mine too.
But, you know, if anything, I thought perhaps let's resist this temptation, because having a mediated conversation with this particular book just didn't feel right. So I read the whole thing.
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
But let me just quickly introduce Matthew a little bit more. Matthew has a PhD from War Studies at King's College and is currently serving at the War Studies Department as Associate Professor at the Swedish Defense University.
Correct.
But this is his third book.
That's right.
With Oxford University Press.
That's right, yes.
And War in the Smartphone Age, how did you get the idea?
I got the idea getting frustrated at looking at nonsense on my phone and wanting to understand what the hell was going on.
I'm sure we've all been there. But in the book, you start with talking about civilians and the conduct of war, and how the smartphone has revolutionized and democratized civilian participation, but also civilian states, both agency and vulnerability in the execution and representation of war. And then you talk about a fairly technical evolution of kill chains. I'd like us to anchor the conversation there. And for our audience, if you could just explain a little bit about kill chains, what they are, how they came to be, and then we'll weave into the political economy of the ecosystem that include tech giants and the implications for us all going forward. So, can we start with that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a miserable thing to be talking about on a Saturday morning, so well done to everyone who has decided to join us. Kill chains, the idea of a kill chain has a long history in war, to at least aerial bombardment, and it's fantastic, it seems to me, that we have Air Marshal Amir here with us as well. But to at least the First World War, really though, I anchor kill chains in the period during the global war on terror, which I am not nostalgic for in any way, shape or form, but there was a lot going on there, including the idea of finding, fixing, finishing, exploiting and analysing. So the idea of finding the enemy and then fixing them and then attacking them in some way, shape or form is at the heart of what a kill chain is. And there's a process of looping where you find some information, and then as you find more information, digital information in the global war on terror terms, on the location that you're investigating, that you're striking, you gather up that digital information from people's phones and computers and whatever, and then feed that back into the intelligence cycle. And then you have a process of creating a kill chain. And the faster you can run this kill chain, the more targets you can identify and therefore strike. And if you can attack more targets more quickly, then the claim is that you can effectively defeat your enemy in detail. You can strike their targets more quickly than they can identify yours, and then you can render them, you can incapacitate them. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I've just had a coffee delivered, which is very kind. So this is and this is predominantly a military framing of thinking about attacking targets. And I think one of the things I've been trying to do, one of the things I definitely do in War in the Smartphone Age, is to try to show how that process is also democratized. That the technologies that are being used to make that kill chain work in a military sense are also available to civilians, and civilians are therefore actively participating in that process of a kill chain, if you will, and we can see that in Ukraine and in a number of other places.
I think this is a good moment to confess that I've been slightly cheeky. When we were talking about the seating arrangements, I deliberately placed the retired the retired Air Marshal in the center, because this is a conversation about war and the relationships that exist between the civilians, the military, and the private sector. So we thought we might as well put the retired Air Marshal at the center of the conversation as well. But if I may bring you in, the retired Air Marshal has been a fighter pilot for 35 years and also has served as the chairman of the PAF's Center for Artificial Intelligence and Computing. I would like to ask you to, in your conversation with the book, when Matthew talks about the experiences from Ukraine and the experiences from Gaza and the experiences from even like parts of Africa, I think you've done a good sort of global distilling of examples within the book, which is why it was fascinating. I think for our audience, particularly this city, Lahore, which experienced war last year, you know, a process that sort of very quickly normalized this idea of drone swarms over Pakistani cities with citizen participation. This is something that at this moment speaks very differently to Pakistani audiences, particularly here in Lahore. I wanted to ask you, how did you react to the content of the book, and how does the Pakistani experience speak to the other textual examples that Matthew has brought into it?
Thank you, Azima, for your question. I think it's a very broad question you've asked. There are many parts of this. First of all, I would like to congratulate Matthew for his book, which was well written, very interesting for me at least. And again, you also had many areas covered in your book, but you were specific about the mobile and how the mobile has been able to now act like a command and control center, actually. So I would like to first of all clear for the audience also and for public in general that he talks about the war in the age of mobile phone. Now the term war is much different from battle. The war is ongoing, and in war you have every aspect which is part of the war. It's the diplomacy, the intelligence, the military, the economy. So it's an ongoing sort of thing, and we are actually in a state of war all of the time, and also the law affairs. And it's not essentially that only the kinetic action is supposed to be the war, which can be considered as a battle, but not the war. And war, with the passage of time and with more cyber coming in, more technology coming in, it's going to be mostly in other domains, like media, cyber attacks, and the notion of victory is mostly going to be on the mobile phones, which is suggested by Matthew also, that how the civilians are going to be integrated into that. So that is what we saw during Ukraine as well as Gaza and in Pakistan-India war as well. That there was a lot of narrative which was being built by the civilians, and that was through the mobile phones, through the YouTube channels, through X, and so we were able to have a narrative which was by the civilians, and it was through different social media channels which were visible to us. But I would say that what Matthew has mentioned about the kill chain, you cannot mirror image the same kill chain in Gaza and in Ukraine. Especially regular and irregular warfare has got a different way of having the kill chain. It is, sensors, shooters, and in between you have the communication lines which are there, whether it can be through satellite, through cables, or through any of the, channels. But the important thing is that you have to take a decision, which Matthew mentions in his book, with a terminology which is known as OODA loop, which is that observe, orientate, decide, and act. So this OODA loop has to be minimum, whether it's a regular warfare in Ukraine versus Russia, or Azerbaijan versus Armenia, or an irregular sort of warfare as in Gaza, or towards our western side of the border, or any terrorist or counter-terrorist operations which we are doing. So this OODA loop, I mean, the term was coined by Colonel John Boyd, and it is that the philosophy of OODA loop is the one which is completely mentioned in Matthew's book. That you have to act fast, you have to act faster than the enemy, and that is where you put him into a decision dilemma. And the one who can act fast through the processing of the data, through the data channels, through integrating sensors and shooters much more effectively, is going to win the war, is going to win the narrative, is going to win any regular or irregular sort of war. So I think the Colonel John Boyd, this terminology of OODA loop, he himself was, by the way, a fighter pilot, and he was the one who actually designed the F-16 aircraft also. And I, being a flyer of that, I can see that sort of, depiction of the philosophy within that aircraft. And it is visible because of its agility, because of its aerodynamics, and because of the way the decision support tools are available within the F-16. So, lastly, I would like to say this thing that all these wars, their final outcome is mostly being built by the civilians. And the civilians have got so much of participation, so much of collection of data, so much of intelligence, that intelligence which used to be the domain of the military only, today you have much more intelligence available on your mobile phones. And through the channels which are also mostly civilian channels. I mean, the way I was saying that the tools which are available to us in our command and control centers are supposed to be the weather, the imagery, the battle damage assessment, and placement of our assets, etc. Actually, you can have all that data today on the mobile phones through the social media channels. And you can then participate in the war by giving your opinion that whether that target has been hit effectively, whether we have been able to score 6-0 or 12-0 or 10-0, and similarly the Indians claiming themselves that we have been able to destroy so many Pakistani jets on ground or targeting so many bases on ground. So this was all a war of narrative, and the more it was being mentioned on the social media, and some were the fake news also of some foreign magazines and the channels, etc., that was coming through the civilian, powerhouses of Indian tech industry, etc. So that narrative was being built that who has been able to score victories, because nobody was able to actually confirm those kills or confirm those damages, for the reason that they were happening at so long ranges and with so much of distance and no visibility to the public in journal, that people were deriving the lessons and the notion of victories through whatever was visible or available to them on the social media channels. So there is something which is happening in the wars in Ukraine also, where you can see a bias of the West. And sorry to say in your book also, I could see that that mostly it is that in Ukraine you can see whether it's the X or whether it's the YouTube channels or it's the Meta, they are blocking all those contents which are pro-Russian, and they are propagating and advocating all which is pro-Ukrainian, because the West is trying to give them more flip and give them more air in the social media. Yeah.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. There are a few continuing points from the Air Marshal's comments. I think there are two parts of the conversation. One, with respect to kill chains. One is on the notion of targeting. How is that targeting decision made? How is it contextually different? And the second is what it means for narrative. Yeah. So two thoughts that I had. One was well, what do we need in terms of kill chains? Where there's a lot of public blowback in a country like Pakistan, if you get that decision wrong, if you get the target wrong, you know, it sort of feeds into a lot of building community and public grievance against the state. Secondly, people behave differently, and you've talked about this at length in your book. That contexts where, like Gaza, where people often give their mobile phones to their families. In Pakistan too, mobile phones are shared assets, right? So, you know, this conversation about targeting is also then different from this conversation about narrative building. And a thought that I came away with was, you know, given how you described Putin's war and how Russian information dissemination was largely targeting, for instance, Indian audiences, right? Are wars to fight wars at data speed, to use your language?
Yes.
Our inability to fight wars at data speed means that there's an increasing reliance of the military on, you know, large swathes of data.
Yeah.
And AI is unpredictable and unexplained
Yes.
in terms of how it reaches its conclusions. So what does that mean for wars in the future? Does that mean also that they're going to be largely produced? But also, just to also bring in that last point that the Air Marshal mentioned, I do want to give you some credit. You do mention military Orientalism, about how the West, or Western prejudice in fact, misunderstood Russian, you know, or so misconceived the Russian way of war, and you had Oriental notions applied to the analysis, which was in fact dangerous. I think there's a lot of that going on with respect to China as well, particularly in the India-Pakistan conflict, where the performance of Chinese tech was, you know, for the first time visible, but also it became kind of a metaphor for war and perhaps a future war in the Eastern Theater. So if you could sort of take all of those comments and address them one by one, take as much time as you need.
A small request. Okay, so let's just go back to some basics. I mean, as I don't directly talk about India-Pakistan in the book, principally because there wasn't anything obviously going on that would give me the evidence base from which I could. I mean, of course, as the Air Marshal just pointed out, there's a constant state of tension between Pakistan and India. But the means by which I could show how some of the things I was interested in were going on here was very hard to pull out. But if I just think laterally for a moment about the situation, and as I came to Pakistan, I was interested in smartphone. How many people own smartphones in Pakistan? And it's about 30%. So around 70 million people, if I understand it correctly, 70 million people out of 250, 60 million people. So there's a large proportion of the population that don't have smartphones. On top of that, there is rolling out 5G tech is happening across, 7 cities in Pakistan over the next couple of months. So we're relying on 4G and 3G technology in the first instance in order to, and the International Telecoms Union of the United Nations says that around 96% of the world can access at least a 3G network. Now, at the heart of some of the things I'm talking about really is that civilian communications are able to transmit data more quickly than military communications. It's just built into the tech in your phone. You can communicate at greater speed built off the cell phone networks you have than the armed forces can built off the specific networks that the armed forces have. Of course, there are good reasons for that, along the lines that the armed forces need hardened communications infrastructure that can withstand electromagnetic interference, some kind of electronic warfare and all these other bits and pieces. But effectively, civilians have the capacity to communicate more quickly than the armed forces. There are moments when the armed forces or the state might switch off the telecoms network or make some social media platforms more available than others at different times, depending on the circumstances. But if you think about, and those can be for good and valid military reasons, but the internet itself is designed to remain open irrespective. At the heart of it, it was designed around the possibility of a nuclear strike, and so there are always ways round, in terms of communication, around any bottlenecks that are put in place by government, whether it's the dark web, whether it's other ways of getting online via VPN, and that creates some structural imbalances between the armed forces and society more broadly. So, for example, and I hesitate to say this because it's not a scenario I wish on Pakistan or India, but should war come, the question I think you need to be reflecting on is the fact that in India, if there is rolling out a 5G network across Pakistan will help the economy in all sorts of important ways. But that limited access to 5G networks, if India has more 5G capacity and more smartphone penetration, then effectively civilians can leverage that information advantage in a way that, should Pakistan have to go into India, then Pakistan's armed forces will be confronted with a civilian population that understands how to communicate and communicate more effectively than if Indian armed forces were in Pakistan. And that information disadvantage will become a problem for the armed forces. It doesn't matter how much we try to massage this, and you can see that in Ukraine. Ukraine is a very connected society, and availability of smartphone internet connections have created the conditions in which the Russian armed forces have an additional civil society layer of challenge to get through when it comes to fighting its way into Ukraine. So, for example, when Russia attacked both to the northwest and northeast of Kiev in the opening phases of the war, and something like 90, as the Russians were advancing to the east, they advanced down one road and they pushed armoured columns, they didn't mobilise their infantry, and so effectively they were moving without appropriate infantry screens, which made them more vulnerable when they were confronted with the enemy. Principally along the lines of civilians were flying civilian drones over the Russian advance and communicating that information back to artillery units and then adjusting fire. Now that was an integration of civilians and the armed forces in order to make it harder for Russians to advance to the northeast of Kiev. And it seems to me that scenario that's going to just be a common scenario. There will be ways that electronic warfare can interfere in that, but it's in no one's advantage to switch the internet off for a long period of time because your economy will be completely destroyed as a result. So, the internet as a space through which you manage both the economy and war, and indeed representation of war, how media talks about war, is going to depend on the internet. And it seems to me it is of course possible and has happened that the internet gets switched off. I make reference to the war in Ethiopia, in Iran of course. But the remarkable thing about Iran is the amount of social media stuff that comes out. Exactly so. So
the Skylink comes in.
Precisely so. So there are all sorts of other ways of getting online that will complicate the challenge facing the armed forces, and indeed complicate the way narratives are constructed. I mean, in Pakistan, if there are 30% of people with smartphones, then my guess is, and forgive me if I get this wrong, but my guess is that most people are reading mainstream media, news broadcasts, and reading their newspaper. And then a elite, dare I say, I don't know whether that's an elite or a middle class who have access to smartphone technology may be shaping the narrative there. But then the question is, how do you bridge that divide between mainstream and print media, news broadcast and print media, and what's going on online amongst a community that has access to smartphone technology? And that changes the dynamics, the political dynamics, and how messaging works in Pakistan and indeed in India. And I think being attentive to these structural divides, as it were, these digital divides, is very important for thinking through both narrative formation and indeed the conduct of war. And you asked me about AI as well. I don't know, do you want to...
Yes, if you could address the AI question and the military Orientalism.
Oh yeah, the military Orientalism. Military Orientalism, let's start with military Orientalism. The West is very good, I mean, and dare I say it, OODA loops and the whole framing of kill chains, that may or may not be how other parts of the world choose to fight. But it's a very pervasive, way of thinking, and it's partly, and it creates all sorts of problems. You see through the lens of the OODA loop, and then suddenly, if the Russians don't fight like the Americans, then they're doing something wrong. And that may or may not be how the Russians choose to fight. But instead of going back to battle and going back to the evidence base and thinking carefully through what you're seeing there, and avoiding the imposition of a particular lens, a Western lens, you can start to reflect on what's happening. And so some of those mistakes were built in 2004, from 2014, where analysts in DC would go and look at what was going on in Ukraine, look at a particular battle, and they were interpreting that battle through an American lens without actually going and walking the battlefield, without going and talking to Ukrainians, without going and investigating properly. And of course, when a journalist did go and do that, and they had a military experience themselves, when they did go and do that, they found that the analysis that was being repeated in DC bore no relation to what was going on the battlefield. And the result of which is you start to incorporate that into your analyses, which drives a whole series of political choices going on in the Pentagon and in the armed forces, which appeals to a particular agenda in those parts of the American bureaucracy, but may or may not reflect actually how the Russians have been fighting or not. So being attentive to this, I think personally, is very important, because firstly, that difference is worth paying attention to and is interesting in itself, but also, if the West insists on treating everywhere else as inadequate compared to the West, then this is clearly a category mistake, and we need to get past that in a very serious way. On the AI side of things, clearly the challenge for you and I, when we're looking at our smartphone, is getting past the noise. AI is creating more crap, basically, and we have to interpret what's going on in our smartphones. And it seems to me that there are all sorts of really rather serious challenges here. I was giving a talk at for the UK Cabinet Office meeting conference, and a fact-checking organisation told me that every day they scrape for 100,000 facts for disinformation. But they only fact-check 10 of those 100,000 that they get every day. And it seems to me that the idea that we can fact-check in this media ecosystem, where there is an enormous amount of both online chatter amongst everyone who's sharing their opinion, whether it's an informed opinion. My expertise as someone who has studied war is irrelevant compared to the billions of other people online. I just get shouted down. That flattening of expertise makes it very hard for everyone in this room to try and distinguish between whatever is being put out by users, but also increasingly between AI bots that are producing more and more crap online. And the danger, I suppose, for online community is that there's a constant exchange between bots, but without any actual media engagement, but any engagement between users. And just to finish that point, the danger is then for a platform owners is that it just switches users off. There is no longer any community to engage with. And so there's a balance that the platforms themselves must strike between having a space where this kind of disinformation game can happen for clickbait purposes, and where people get a sense of community. And I think that balance is always going to be negotiated.
Air Marshal Saab, how do you react to the scenario that Matthew has built, which is that connectedness in a competitive Pakistan-India context will matter in future wars? So if there is a deficit of connectivity on the Pakistani side, then that is a net negative for Pakistan when it comes to seeing out that competition. So how do you respond to that claim, and also other points that Matthew has raised?
I totally agree with this fact that, that connectedness, integration, fusion of assets, they are the main, I think, winning strategy for any of the country. In future, mainly the wars are going to be in air. Most of the battles are going to be fought in air, whether it is manned aircraft or drones or any other missiles, etc. So that is what we have seen between India and Pakistan also. And anything which can be more high tech, it is always the air force of any of the country which works with speed and with integration. Speed and integration are essentially required for any person to win over his enemy and to put his enemy into the decision dilemma. And this is what exactly happened in Pulwama and in Pahalgam also. That Pakistan Air Force has mostly been in the camps of Western countries as far as its training, its Air Force weapon systems are concerned. And after the Second World War, one of the major lessons for the West and for the Americans was that you have to win in the air before you have to win on the ground or in the sea. And because of that, they have always employed their Air Force very independently. Whereas the Indians were mostly in the Russian camps since independence, and they have, mostly used Air Force as an air artillery, being more dependent upon the ground forces or the naval forces, rather than being proactive and creating that shock and awe effect which mostly the Western Air Forces believe. Because they believe that Air Force is the only force which can strike directly the heart of the enemy. And to do that, you have to have the control of the air. And for control of the Air Force has to be employed independently. So because of this, Pakistan Air Force has always been employed independently. Its decision making has been very straight, whereas there had been a lot of layers of decision making in Indian military and Indian Air Force as well. So these have been the points which I would say had been in favor of Pakistan. Of course, the training aspect also, and the employment strategy also, which was there articulated by the Pakistan Air Force. Lastly, I would say that conceptually, Pakistan has, especially the Pakistan Air Force, has always believed in system-centric approach, and the Indians have employed their assets mostly in a platform-centric approach. Like you have Rafale, you have Su-30s, you have S-400s, you have drones which are state-of-art. All these are, I think, much more superior than the technology which Pakistan Air Force has. But they all were not well integrated into a single data link and were not fused together for a common operating picture, because of which they could not carry out the multi-domain operations which Pakistan Air Force was able to do. We had lesser assets, I would say less superior in technology as well for the first time. Previously Pakistan Air Force had always had better technology and less numbers. But this time I would say with Rafales and S-400s and their own drones, they had a superiority as far as the technology is concerned. But they used them independently as weapon systems, not as weapon systems, but as platforms, which were not very much fused together. Whereas we were able to have all our players in the air with a common operating picture through a common tactical data link. And this fusion, which the philosophy Matthew talks in his book of integration and having a common way of participating in the war through integration of the technology and fastening of the OODA loop. So that philosophy was visible in Pakistan Air Force employment. And that is what created the difference. That was able to increase the speed of the kill chain, which we were able to employ against our enemy in a superior way. We were able to shoot them before they even thought of shooting us. There was not a single Meteor. Meteor is one of the finest and one of the best missiles presently in market. Was not able to be employed against Pakistan Air Force, against a Chinese platform, and that superiority was visible in the first 1 hour of the mission, where they were able to shoot, Pakistan Air Force was able to shoot at least 6 their jets. That was something which actually put them into a decision paralysis, I would say. And this is what actually the thing which is visible in the book, which Matthews also talk about, the speed of action through a faster OODA loop, a faster kill chain, and through a system-based approach. If you see the West, whenever they induct any system, it is the complete system, which includes the logistics, the maintenance, the connectivity, the link 16, which you are reading a lot nowadays also. So this link actually integrate all the systems within that system of the systems. And if you have the ground control sensors, which are the radars, the airborne radars, the sensors which are electronic warfare sensors, integrated with your shooters, which are the missiles, the F-16's weapon system, J-10 and all these. And there's a very fast communication link, which is assisted through AI decision support tools. So you will have a faster kill chain, much faster. I mean, it's going to be like a hyper war going on. And that is what makes the difference in any future conflict as well. Thank you.
Okay, so if I may interrogate this a little bit. I think the integration of military capabilities and military data systems, I think we've had a very good demonstration of that in Pakistan. The architecture Matthew is talking about says future wars need the integration of the military's own data systems, both internal and external, but you need a rapid integration of civilian data. And a lot of that is going to come via this conduit of this big bad giant that is the tech companies, yes. Right? So us, people who are on our smartphones, and I can see everybody has a smartphone, everybody has as a user agency, but then people within private sector companies who are employees of those private sector companies also have agency around ethical questions about whether or not they want to do something, right? So you have talked about the militarization of Silicon Valley and why that should be prevented if we are not to get caught up in endless wars, right? So as a Pakistani, I'm sat here thinking, how far along is Pakistan in actually integrating civilian data? Because what is opaque to me is this relationship that Pakistan has with the tech companies and giants, which is weaker than other countries, because a lot of the tech giants don't have their offices here, and we have fewer levers of power and influence to exercise with them. Plus, apparently, we're not a big enough market in spite of the numbers, so there's a sense there that's misleading as well. So if I, want to ask my own government questions, that's where my mind goes. But also the caution that you're throwing, Matthew, about the future militarization of tech and that particular elite capture and the kind of changes and fueling of war that's going to drive, that gives me a lot of pause. So I'm going to leave those questions to both of you to answer. So we'll come to Matthew first and then to the Air Marshal.
So it's true that the technologies that are in your hands, connected to cloud compute, are the same technologies that the armed forces are relying on increasingly to digitally connect the battlefield to the back office. And the capacity to set up a military Internet of Things is basically, at the moment at least, running off the same technology that you have in the palm of your hands, which is why you're in a position to do things in a way that the armed forces can, but in a different, I mean, clearly not everyone has access to an F-16, but there are ways to integrate civil society into that process of targeting, as we've just described. But the platform technology that makes that all possible, of course, is via Amazon Web Services or Google or a number of other technology giants. And just to give you a hard example, I mean, Israel is one of the most, if not, in my mind, possibly the most sophisticated actor when it comes to using digital technology in the world. It's for the poor Gazans, of course, it's working in an operating environment that's 40 kilometers by 6. And they're working, the Israelis have been working in a space where there has been no contestation of the electromagnetic spectrum. So the Palestinians obviously do not have the capacity to interfere with any data communication that the Israelis might have. So effectively, Israel is operating in a space where it has complete dominance over the electromagnetic spectrum and can communicate at will. Has fiber optic all the way up to the front line, and yet, even though it has all of these advantages, the Israelis were producing so much data that effectively they could not process the data on the basis of their own sovereign military tech centers, right? They had to outsource, ultimately, to process that data to Amazon and Google, effectively turning people working in those spaces for Google and Amazon into what I've just provocatively, and I do it purposely, provocatively titled the munitions workers of the 21st century. And no doubt then you can understand why some people who are working in the Valley might be actively protesting about how they have become directly implicated in processes of war and oppression in parts of the world that they had never realized that they were getting involved in when they signed up to work for big tech in the US. I think the implications of that for someone like Pakistan are clear, really. You know, processing data, working with AI, working in an AI context is going to demand cloud compute. And the capacity to access and leverage AI in those circumstances almost certainly implies, it seems to me, and Air Marshal will no doubt correct me, but almost certainly implies that Pakistan will need to make use of this, of some kind of tech infrastructure that is not necessarily sovereign to Pakistan. It may be some of the technologies might be located in Pakistan, but the platforms themselves, the software and all the rest of it almost certainly will be maintained by software engineers and others who have been trained, experienced, and others out of Pakistan. Right? Now, the implications from an India-Pakistan context are, especially in that, you know, Israel, India are working in a way that is leveraging their technology infrastructures, and that clearly has implications for the strategic balance between India and Pakistan, and implies, in my mind, that Pakistan needs to think very carefully about how it will go about accessing cloud compute in order to maintain some of that strategic balance, so that we don't have a situation in which the escalation dynamic runs out of control and you end up having to ask J.D. Vance and Donald to come back and resolve some of these differences again.
Yeah, I totally agree with this fact, you know, because I think in future who's going to control the electromagnetic spectrum is going to be the one who's going to control the tempo of war or any conflict. Secondly, I personally think that we need to have a civil-military jointness as far as the data sharing is concerned, as far as the data centers are concerned, as far as the storage and processing and analysis is concerned. But unfortunately, it's not like that still in Pakistan. While we have good integrated Air Force or Army or Navy, but the civilian assets and the civilian data is not being shared by the military very well, or military data vice versa isn't being shared, and that may be because of the trust deficit or because of maybe the awareness we don't have regarding this particular fact. But you cannot have a common operating picture or a true multi-domain operations till the time you have civil military data at jointly being stored, processed and analyzed. And while Matthew may say that it's the weaponization of the tech industry in the Silicon Valley, but I personally think that the military industrial complex has to handshake with the tech industry to produce weapons which are much more precise, which are much more fast, which have a better processing speed and accuracy as well. So this has to go hand in hand, and there's no other way that this will not happen in future as well. Secondly, I would also say that, you know, the point of, you know, that do we have the capacity to store so much of data where we can have the AI, you know, being fueled by the data, and that sort of software is being applied on our weapon systems or our processes or our decision support tools, etc. Do we have that much capacity? I personally think we don't have at this point in time. And the cloud computing may be being done for us or maybe outsourced to Google or somebody else, which is not very safe. So that is where, the thing comes in that this is a complete stack which Matthew mentions in his book, that it's the complete infrastructure which you need to have your own. If you need to have that level of safety and that level of, integration as well as requirement in case of any contingency. But if there's a backdoor, if somebody else is controlling your storage, processing, or your, analysis, then you are not doing it very safely. This is very important for any future software, any future applications, any future hardware also. So we have to go for that level of indigenization as far as the whole process of stack is concerned. Lastly, I would say that, that either you do it complete or you don't do it. The partial thing is always counterproductive. If you have a war zone and where you have players and few of the players are not integrated well, then those players actually become a liability for you. And this is true for the complete integration net working which you create, that all the players have to be integrated well. All your departments, all government, I would say, institutions, they have to be integrated together to create that sort of effect. Otherwise, partial digitization or partial implementation of this concept will not work. And lastly, this sort of technology is at times not very effective against a player who doesn't have the technology at all. If you see this sort of technology being implemented in Afghanistan or certain part of Syria, we could see that effectiveness in Afghanistan of the high-tech equipment or integration or the response of the American forces. There were still a lot of casualties. There was still, because the terrorists, they had no infrastructure to be hacked. They had no infrastructure to be defeated by the enemy, They were actually living in caves. They used to regroup together as and when they were supposed to ambush the Americans, and they used to do it at will and the point and time of their choosing, actually. Because they were actually, maneuvering and operating, and their whole infrastructure was very conventional way of applying that. So this technology may not be very effective against.
No, I've still. Yeah, use this.
2 minutes.
So this is very important that that the type of enemy whom you are or the adversary whom you are actually targeting need to have some level of infrastructure where you can destroy that and inhibit his ability to maneuver, or his decision-making loop can be targeted. Like Pakistan versus India war, which was there, Ukraine versus Russia, Azerbaijan versus Armenia, you were able to target the air defenses and target their radars, etc. That is possible, and that will destroy their OODA loop actually. Yeah.
I think this is a good moment to bring in the audience. Is there somebody who has a question? Okay, I see the lady in the back. I see you first. Then I see the gentleman at the front, and then, sir, the gentleman in the jacket, yes, and the yellow jacket is 4. So that is the order of questions. If we can have the lady, please introduce yourself, keep your question tight and brief, and indicate who you'd like to direct it to.
Okay. Hello, Matthew. I have question regarding to extremely opposite role of smartphone during war. As Harari wrote in his book Nexus that we are all entrapped in algorithmic jail, and he quoted the Rohingya genocide in which Facebook played a very devastating role. Okay.
The Rohingya genocide.
Rohingya genocide. Yuval Noah Harari quoted in his book Nexus that Rohingya genocide in which Facebook played a very devastating role. However, in the first chapter of his book, he emphasized the importance of information, that how Charami saved an entire battalion by delivering the important message. So what do you think that how do we create a balance between these two extremes or contradiction? during a war that
Thank you.
So genocide and what was the other bit of question? So just to clarify, Myanmar and genocide is one end of this, and accelerating violence using social media, and the other side of it was
importance of message during war.
okay. Messaging terror. So I mean, so Facebook admits its role in promoting genocide in Myanmar. There was an independent inquiry into how Facebook was involved. It went along the lines of Facebook, when selling smartphones, Facebook was introduced into as a social media platform on the smartphone that was being sold in Myanmar. And so the citizens of Myanmar bought the phone, and instead of buying a data contract, they used Facebook to get online. So Facebook became the internet for citizens of Myanmar. And then Facebook didn't put any kind of controls over what kind of conversations were being had on Facebook. And that created the conditions in which anyone could say anything. And clearly, I'm not trying to suggest that there wasn't any social animosity, any political animosity between communities in Myanmar before Facebook, but clearly you can amplify that and promote and direct and shape some of those discussions to produce the kinds of conditions in which political violence accelerates out of any kind of, and given that there's no interest maybe within Myanmar itself to try and control some of that, it worked very well as a platform for promoting genocide. And I think increasingly social media without some of these controls, where no one in Silicon Valley really has the understanding of what the media ecosystems that working in other parts of the world don't even necessarily speak the languages, and AI has not been mobilized in such a way as to sort of, some languages are oral languages. You're not going to be able to code those into an AI and then be able to look for particular references to war or political violence, because there's just no money for the platforms in coding those languages. So I think there has a strong potential that this will accelerate in ways that the platforms themselves can't control. That also has a dynamic in war, of course, and the danger really is that these narratives exist outside of a kind of strategic communication that's been established by the state and the armed forces, that leads to an escalatory dynamic that can't easily be managed itself. So people then become more emotionally engaged in seeing a particular political outcome in a conflict in a way that the state itself is struggling to hold back. And so that then pushes, it makes it harder to achieve some kind of political settlement or some way of getting off the escalation ladder. So I think, social media is a distorting prism here, which I think is why we need to be very attentive to what's going on in these spaces, because it's very easy to get sucked in and then find yourself amplifying crap that also then promotes more conflict in whatever way, shape or form. In Pakistan, the thing to remember is that it's only we're talking about only 30% of the population. The question is how does that kind of language online get positioned into mainstream media, into broadcast and print media, and how does that astroturfing is important to pay attention to, because just because people aren't online doesn't mean that they're not being influenced by what's going on online. And because journalists are using the social media as a way of sort of getting access to stories that they wouldn't otherwise get. So being attentive to how that astroturfing works, but equally what's going on in print and broadcast media is also shaping what's going on in the social media context. So, you've got to be very careful and pay close attention to the dynamics between mainstream and social media when it comes to thinking through how political violence and how wars are being narrated. I hope that speaks to your question.
So I am determined to get these 3 questions in, and we have the last 5 minutes remaining. So, sir, you get to go. Then blue jacket, yellow jacket, and we'll come to you. Yes. Project.
Just love it. So you both talked about the war of narrative. So to weaken the enemy's data leverage, 2 things come in mind. First, you could attack their data centers, and then you could spread misinformation using AI chatbots. What else, could be used to weaken the enemy's data leverage? And secondly, you both talk about integrating the citizens with the military, how to integrate the data and use that in warfare to a country's advantage. But what if the citizens have restrictions about their privacy? It's one thing to be integrated during times of war, but what about in times of peace? What about those concerns?
So a couple of very quickly. The virtue of the cloud is, of course, that data is stored in all sorts of places around the world. The armed forces may or may not specify where they hold their data, but the question really, from a cyber perspective, is identifying where that data is being held. But attacking a data center isn't necessarily going to result in a break in available information associated with intelligence collection, finding and fixing enemy targets. So, the point about the cloud is it introduces resilience in a way that complicates the sets of challenges facing the armed forces in trying to, as you say, maintain data dominance in some way, shape or form. The other part of the question is really that if you have a smartphone, then you can digitally participate in conflict. It doesn't matter whether you're on the front lines or on the other side of the world. You can film something, broadcast it because you have the means to do that, to publish, consume and broadcast media all from one device. Or you could do that on the front lines, or you can amplify all of that messaging from another part of the world. The one thing that it does do, though, is it means that you participate in conflict. And if you're participating, then you have to ask yourself, what does that do between the distinction between being a civilian and a combatant? My suggestion to you is that it collapses the distinction between civilian and combatant, and it makes everyone a participant. And by implication, by dint of carrying a digital device, you become potentially a combatant, right? And so therefore you become a target.
Sir,
My
30
question,
seconds for your question.
okay, so my question is that when we're thinking of developing a digitally adept society in the far north in Pakistan, we see that people complain about how the military, because of its protectiveness over the strategic communications in that region, it does not let, let's say, other actors except ESCOM provide internet services over there. Do you think that they're thinking in the military about providing this sort of environment where where we can provide more internet access to the people over there in a safe, because the goal is not to become go back to the caves, but to maybe, let's say, become more like Estonia,
So the military centre is in a really difficult place, right? On the one hand, the traditional role of the military centre has been to limit information flow, access to battlefields by print journalists and media journalists. And journalists are the easiest way of framing what comes out in an information context, right? But the smartphone itself obviously circumvents all of what a journalist, you yourself, as Elon will tell you, if you're on X, then you are the news, right? Because you effectively can just circumvent this whole challenge, right? So, of course, the military centre has an interest in trying to limit connectivity in places that where they need to manage the news story. And you can see that in relation to the Iranian attacks, missile attacks on Israel, where, early on, Israelis were broadcasting this fantastical sight of missiles dropping onto Tel Aviv or whatever, and they themselves couldn't bring themselves to, they were filming this stuff and then broadcasting it. At which point the military centre said, hold on a minute, if you do this, then you're providing battle damage assessment. You're giving information to Iranians as to what it is that you're targeting. Now, on the one hand, you can say, well, we're going to create a context in which the armed forces, civil society realises that they need to limit what they broadcast, so they self-censor. But, and you can see that in Ukraine. But, or you can actively move to switch things off or try to control what is broadcast. But as I said to you, the underlying challenge, it seems to me, is that there are all sorts of technologies, and Air Marshal pointed out, Starlink and other platforms, ways of getting online that just circumvent and make the challenge for the military centre that much harder. And I just don't see how that, the direction of travel here is one in which the military centre is going to find it harder and harder.
So we are now into overtime, but sir, your question, and then madam, your question. And anybody else who has a question, I would suggest have a conversation with the panelists before they exit the room or in the break. But sir, please go.
Yes, this is my name. So, just a thought, like going into the digital age, any thoughts about cyber force or maybe space force in order to protect the sanity of all the data and the integration of all the smart devices that you are talking about? Have we ever thought about cyber force or maybe a space force in order to protect it?
I mean, clearly, when it comes to future data environments, having the capacity to manage who has access to your networks and under what circumstances is crucial. But I had a conversation with a vice chancellor of a US university a couple of months ago, and she pointed out that there are 700,000 vacancies for cyber defense, cyber security positions in US government. 700,000. Okay. Now, if the US can't actually, and the US is clearly got a very sophisticated and layered approach to cyber defenses. But if there are 700,000 vacancies in US cyber security positions, I put it to you that probably the rest of the world is going to struggle to maintain its own cyber security, no matter how much effort is put in there. And clearly there's a lot of effort put in. And so it seems to me that it's always going to be a source of vulnerability as different software platforms, hardware platforms are layered onto each other over time, and depending on the evolution of your own IT network and infrastructure, also that brings with it its own vulnerabilities that are going to be challenging and difficult to manage. And so it seems to me that that's just going to be a vulnerability. That is a fact of life. And even though effort is put into hardening these contexts, I don't think there's any. Again, the direction of travel is one in which the exploit points, those who are hacking, are going to have more fun than those who are defending.
So when we talk about the cyber or the AI war, I think you cannot differentiate between civilians and the military, because both the assets are going to be equally vulnerable. So if we have to have a sort of cyber defense or a cyber attack which we have to do, it has to be a joint sort of thing which has to be made under a single command, a cyber command or an AI command or an information operation command, because you have to integrate both civilians and military assets to have a formidable defense against a cyber. Otherwise, the vulnerability of either of the assets is going to affect the national strength. And the defense has to be a collective one against a cyber or an AI or a space. All these have to be at the national level to be integrated with all the assets at your disposal.
Thank you. I think we are at time now, and we're leaving with probably more questions than answers, and the certain knowledge that everybody is a willing or reluctant combatant for the future. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
To our author and the discussant. The book is available? Oh, maybe we don't know that. Oh, do we know if the book is available? All right, so we've identified a little gap. However, if the book is available, please do.
Yes, please do.
Please do have a
smash
browse.
this all over social
and
media.
thank you all for your participation and keeping us to time. So.